The December wind cut through the Ardennes forest like 1,000 frozen knives, and I pulled my worn coat tighter around my chest, knowing it wouldn't make much difference. My name is James Richardson, and on that morning of December 16, 1944, I was 23 years old, standing in a foxhole somewhere in Belgium, surrounded by snow-covered pine trees that looked more like white ghosts than living things. I had been with the 99th Infantry Division for 8 months, long enough to see friends fall, and new faces arrive to replace them, only to disappear just as quickly. The cold wasn't the worst part of war, though it tried to convince you otherwise. The worst part was the waiting, the not knowing when death would come knocking, whether it would be a bullet with your name on it or an artillery shell that didn't care who you were. "Richardson, you awake?" The voice belonged to Private Tommy Martinez, a kid from Texas who never stopped talking about his mama's cooking and the heat back home. Right now, his lips were blue, and his hands shook as he tried to light a cigarette with frozen fingers. "Yeah, I'm awake," I said, my breath forming white clouds in the pre-dawn darkness. "Hard to sleep when your bones feel like they're made of ice." Tommy laughed, but it was a hollow sound. We'd been on the line for 2 weeks, and High Command kept saying the Germans were finished, that this sector was quiet. But something felt wrong. Call it soldier's intuition or maybe just fear, but the silence in these woods was too heavy, too complete. My thoughts drifted to home, to Philadelphia, where my mother would be preparing for her birthday tomorrow, December 17th. She'd be 52, and I'd promised her I'd be there. I touched the small photograph in my breast pocket, the one of her smiling in our backyard, holding her prize-winning roses. The first shell hit at 5:30 a.m. The explosion tore through the frozen ground 50 yards to our left, sending a geyser of dirt, snow, and shattered wood into the air. Before the debris could fall, a second shell hit, then a third, then dozens more. The world became nothing but noise and fire and smoke. "Get down! Get down!" Sergeant Howard was screaming, but his voice was almost lost in the cacophony. I pressed myself into the bottom of the foxhole as the earth shook and trembled like a living thing trying to throw us off. This wasn't random fire. This was a barrage, a deliberate massive bombardment that meant only one thing: the Germans were coming. For 90 minutes, they pounded our positions. I lost count of how many shells fell. I stopped trying to identify the different whistles and screams they made as they arced through the morning sky. I just pressed my face into the frozen mud and prayed each explosion wasn't the one with my name on it. When the shelling finally stopped, the silence that followed was worse than the noise. My ears were ringing so badly I couldn't hear Tommy shouting next to me until he grabbed my shoulder and shook me. "They're coming. Infantry and tanks." I forced myself to look over the rim of the foxhole, and my blood turned colder than the December air. Through the smoke and morning mist, I could see them, hundreds of German soldiers in winter camouflage advancing through the trees. Behind them, the massive shapes of panzer tanks rolled forward like steel monsters. We opened fire, our rifles cracking in the cold air, but there were too many of them. For every German we dropped, 5 more appeared. The sound of the panzers grew louder, their engines roaring, their treads crushing everything in their path. "Fall back! Fall back!" The order came down the line, but falling back meant leaving our positions, meant admitting we were being overrun. I grabbed my rifle and ammunition, helped Tommy out of our foxhole, and we started running. The forest became chaos. Men were shouting, shooting, dying. I saw Lieutenant Morrison take a bullet to the chest and fall without a sound. I saw one of our trucks explode when a Panzerfaust hit it square in the engine block. The smell of cordite, blood, and diesel filled the air. We ran for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, trying to form a new line, trying to find some place we could make a stand. Behind us, the German advance continued, relentless and overwhelming. By nightfall, we'd been pushed back 3 miles. Our company had started the day with 140 men. We had maybe 60 left. We dug new foxholes in new ground, and I sat there in the darkness, my hands still shaking, wondering if I'd see another sunrise. The next 3 days were hell on earth. The Germans pushed forward with everything they had, and we gave ground mile by bloody mile. The weather got worse, with heavy snow falling almost constantly, reducing visibility to nearly nothing. The cold was so intense that weapons jammed, engines wouldn't start, and men got frostbite just standing watch. By December 19th, we'd been pushed back to a small village called Krinkelt. What was left of the 99th Division had joined with parts of the 2nd Infantry Division, trying to hold a line that seemed to break further every hour. The casualties were staggering. Tommy had taken shrapnel in his leg, and while he was alive, he couldn't walk. We'd had to leave him at a field hospital in a church that I wasn't sure would still be standing by morning. I'd been promoted to corporal, not because I'd done anything heroic, but because everyone above me was dead. I was now responsible for 8 men, most of whom I barely knew because they were replacements for replacements. The village was a nightmare. Houses were burning, their flames reflecting off the snow in an eerie orange glow. Bodies lay in the streets, both American and German, frozen in the positions where they'd fallen. The sound of artillery was constant, a thunder that never stopped, that had become so normal I barely noticed it anymore. I was sitting in what used to be someone's living room, the walls pockmarked with bullet holes, trying to clean my rifle with fingers that barely worked. My mind kept drifting to my mother. Today was December 19th. Her birthday had been 2 days ago. I wondered if she'd gotten my last letter, the one I'd written 3 weeks ago. Corporal Richardson. The voice made me look up. It was Captain Lewis, a tall man from Virginia, who'd been a school teacher before the war. He looked exhausted, his face grey with fatigue and cold. "I need you and your squad to hold the crossroads at the east end of the village. Intelligence says there's a German column heading this way, and if they take that crossroads, they'll cut us off completely." I wanted to ask him how we were supposed to hold anything with 8 men and barely enough ammunition to last an hour, but I didn't. "You didn't ask those questions anymore. You just nodded and went." "Yes, sir." "Richardson," he said as I started to leave, "I know this seems impossible, but if we can hold them here even for a few hours, it gives everyone else time to establish a better defensive line." I gathered my squad, and we moved through the burning village toward the crossroads. The men looked at me with hollow eyes, and I wondered what I could possibly say to them that would make any difference. We were all living on borrowed time, and we knew it. We set up what defensive positions we could, using rubble and abandoned vehicles for cover. Private Wilson, a quiet kid from Iowa, had a bar, a Browning automatic rifle, which gave us at least some firepower. Private Jackson and Private O'Brien had a single bazooka with 3 rockets. The rest of us had M1 Garans and whatever ammunition we could scrounge. The German column appeared an hour later, just as twilight was fading into full darkness. 4 tanks and maybe 50 infantry soldiers, advancing with the confidence of men who'd been winning for 3 days straight. "Hold your fire until they're close," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. "We get one chance at this." The lead tank was 20 yards away when Wilson opened up with the bar, its rapid fire tearing into the German infantry. Jackson fired the bazooka, and by some miracle, the rocket hit the lead tank in its tread, immobilizing it. The tank behind it tried to maneuver around, and O'Brien's second rocket caught it in the side, causing an explosion that lit up the night. For a few minutes, we had them stopped, but then their remaining tanks found our positions and started firing their main guns. The world became explosions again. The building I was using for cover took a direct hit, and I was thrown 15 feet by the blast, landing hard on frozen cobblestones. When I came to, maybe 30 seconds later, everything was muffled and distant. I could see Wilson still firing the bar, could see German soldiers advancing through the smoke. I fumbled for my rifle, brought it up, fired at a shape in the darkness. "We can't hold them," someone was screaming. I think it was O'Brien, but I couldn't be sure. Blood was running down the side of my face from a cut on my scalp, and my head felt like it had been split open. I looked around at my squad. Wilson was still fighting. Jackson was dead. His body sprawled next to the bazooka. 3 others were down, and I couldn't tell if they were alive or not. We'd bought maybe 15 minutes. "Fall back," I shouted, my voice hoarse. "Fall back to the command post." We retreated what was left of us, leaving the crossroads to the Germans. I'd lost 5 men, and we hadn't stopped anything, just delayed it slightly. As we stumbled back through the burning village, I felt something break inside me. Not fear, I was beyond fear now, but hope. By December 20th, what remained of our forces had been pushed back to a ridge outside the village. We were surrounded on 3 sides, and ammunition was running critically low. The supply trucks couldn't get through because the Germans controlled most of the roads. We were eating frozen K-rations and drinking melted snow, and men were starting to get sick with dysentery and respiratory infections. I was sitting in a bunker that had been hastily dug into the frozen ground, wrapped in a wool blanket that did almost nothing against the cold. My hands were so numb, I could barely feel them. Around me, the remaining men of my squad sat in silence. We were all thinking the same thing. We weren't going to make it out of this. Captain Lewis appeared at the bunker entrance, his face grim. "Richardson, I need to speak with you privately." I followed him outside into the snow. The morning was grey and heavy, with low clouds that promised more snow. In the distance, we could hear the rumble of tanks and artillery. "We're evacuating the wounded tonight," Lewis said quietly. "There's a convoy willing to make a run for it. Try to break through to our lines. I'm putting you on it." "Sir, I can't leave my men." "Your men are dead or wounded, Corporal. You've been in continuous combat for 5 days. You have a concussion, probable frostbite in 3 fingers, and you're running on nothing but adrenaline." I wanted to argue, but I was too tired, too cold, too everything. "There's something else," Lewis continued. He pulled out a small pad of paper and a pencil from his coat. "Command is trying to get word back to headquarters about our situation, about what we're facing here. They need to understand this isn't just a probe. This is a full-scale offensive. But our radio is out, and runners keep getting killed before they reach friendly lines." He handed me the paper and pencil. "I need you to write a report. Keep it short, just the essential facts. If you make it through, give it to the first officer you see." I took the paper and pencil back to the bunker. My hands were shaking, whether from cold or fatigue or fear, I couldn't tell. I tried to think about what to write, how to capture the horror and desperation of the last 5 days in a few sentences. But my mind kept drifting to my mother. Tomorrow was December 21st, 4 days past her birthday. By now, she'd know something was wrong. The newspapers would be full of reports about heavy fighting in Belgium. She'd be sitting by the radio every night, listening for news, praying my name wasn't on the casualty lists they read. I found myself writing not a military report, but a letter to her. "Dear Mom," I wrote, the pencil scratching against the paper. "I'm writing this from somewhere in Belgium. I don't know if I'll be able to send it, but I need you to know some things." The words came slowly, each one an effort. I told her I was sorry I'd missed her birthday. I told her about the cold, about the men I'd fought beside, about how I thought of her roses when things got dark. I told her I loved her, and that if I didn't make it home, she should know that thinking of her had kept me going. And then, at the end, I wrote something else, not for her, but for command. A single line that summed up everything we'd experienced, everything we'd seen. "The Germans are coming with everything they have, and we can't hold much longer without reinforcements and supplies. This is bigger than anyone realizes." I folded the letter and put it in my breast pocket, next to her photograph. That night, as promised, they loaded the wounded onto whatever vehicles could still run. Captain Lewis personally made sure I got on one of the trucks, despite my protests. "You've done your part, Richardson," he said. "Now go tell them what happened here." The convoy left at 2 a.m. driving without lights through enemy territory, hoping to avoid German patrols. We were in the back of a 2.5 truck, 15 wounded men and me, bouncing over frozen roads, expecting at any moment to be ambushed. We almost made it. 3 miles from friendly lines, a German patrol spotted us. Machine gun fire raked the convoy, killing the driver of our truck. The vehicle swerved off the road and crashed into a ditch. I was thrown clear, landing in deep snow. All around me was chaos. Vehicles burning, men screaming, Germans shouting. I crawled away from the road into the forest, my rifle somehow still in my hands. I don't know how long I walked, hours maybe, or days. The cold was so intense I couldn't feel anything anymore. I just kept moving, kept putting one foot in front of the other because stopping meant dying. I was found by an American patrol from the 101st Airborne on December 22nd, half frozen and delirious. They got me to a field hospital where doctors worked to save my frostbitten fingers. While I was there, semi-conscious, someone found the letter in my pocket. I woke up in a real bed for the first time in months, in a field hospital somewhere behind the lines. My fingers were bandaged and I had an IV in my arm. A nurse, a tired woman with kind eyes whose name tag read Lieutenant Morrison, told me I'd been unconscious for 2 days. "You're lucky," she said. "Another hour out there and you'd have lost your hands to frostbite." I tried to sit up, but she pushed me back down gently. "Rest, Corporal. You're safe now." "My men," I said, my voice cracking. "The 99th Division. What happened?" Her expression told me everything before she spoke. "It's been rough. The Germans launched a massive offensive all along the line, but we're holding. Reinforcements are arriving, including General Patton's Third Army." Over the next few days as I recovered, I learned what had happened. The German attack, which would come to be known as the Battle of the Bulge, had been Hitler's last desperate gamble to split the Allied forces and capture the port of Antwerp. It had almost worked. In the first days, they'd overrun several divisions and created a massive bulge in our lines. But men like those in the 99th Division, in villages like Krinkelt, had slowed them down, bought time with their lives. Every hour of delay had allowed reinforcements to arrive, supply lines to be established, defensive positions to be prepared. On December 26th, a colonel I'd never met visited my hospital bed. He was an older man with grey hair and the weathered face of someone who'd been fighting wars for a long time. "Corporal Richardson," he said, pulling up a chair. "I'm Colonel Anderson from Supreme Headquarters. I wanted to talk to you about the letter you were carrying when you were found." My heart sank. I'd forgotten about the letter, about the personal message to my mother mixed with the military report. "Sir, I apologize. I should have written a proper report, not a—" He held up his hand, stopping me. "That letter got to General Eisenhower's desk within 24 hours of you being found. Your single line, 'The Germans are coming with everything they have and we can't hold much longer without reinforcements and supplies.' That line, combined with other reports coming in, helped Command understand this wasn't a minor attack. It was part of what convinced them to redirect the 101st Airborne to Bastogne and rush Patton's army north." I stared at him, unable to process what he was saying. "Your unit, the 99th Division, held them for 3 critical days," he continued. "You and men like you, with your small delaying actions, your desperate stands, you bought us time to organize, to respond, to turn this from a disaster into something we could manage." He stood up, preparing to leave, then paused. "One more thing. We were able to send a telegram to your mother. Let her know you're alive and safe. Given what you've been through, I thought she deserved to know as soon as possible." After he left, I lay there in that hospital bed, trying to understand. All those days of hell, all those men dead, all that fear and cold and blood, it had mattered. Not in the way you see in movies, with grand charges and heroic last stands, but in the small, desperate ways that wars are actually won. Buying time, holding ground, refusing to break even when breaking seems like the only option. I thought about Tommy Martinez, hoping he'd made it. I thought about Captain Lewis and Sergeant Howard, and all the men whose names I'd never learned but whose faces I'd never forget. I thought about the crossroads we'd held for 15 minutes, and how those 15 minutes had been part of something larger. But most of all, I thought about my mother, about her reading that telegram, about her knowing I was alive. I pictured her in our house in Philadelphia, probably crying with relief, probably already writing me a letter about her roses, and how she couldn't wait to see me again. The Battle of the Bulge would continue for another 3 weeks, but the tide had turned. The Germans would be pushed back, their forces depleted, their last chance at victory gone. Thousands of Americans would die before it was over, but thousands more would live because of the men who'd held the line in those first desperate days. I was evacuated to England in January, then sent home to recover in February. By the time I arrived in Philadelphia, spring was beginning to show itself, and my mother's roses were starting to bud. She cried when she saw me, held me like she'd never let go, and didn't ask about the war. Not then, maybe not ever. Years later, historians would write about the Battle of the Bulge, about the strategic decisions and the movements of armies. They'd analyze what went right and what went wrong, debate whether it could have been prevented or handled better. But I think about the small moments, about a letter written in a frozen bunker by a soldier who'd lost hope, about a single line that somehow made it to the right desk at the right time, about 15 minutes at a crossroads that helped buy time for an army to respond. War isn't won by grand gestures or perfect plans. It's won by regular people doing impossible things, by soldiers who keep fighting even when they don't think they can, by mothers who wait at home and keep gardens growing. I kept that photograph of my mother with her roses for the rest of my life. And every December 17th on her birthday, I think about those days in the Ardennes, about the cold and the fear and the men who didn't make it home. I think about how a letter meant for a mother ended up helping to end a battle, because that's what I learned in that frozen forest in Belgium, that every moment matters, every action ripples outward in ways we can't predict, and that hope, real hope, isn't about knowing everything will be okay. It's about keeping going even when you don't know, about writing letters in bunkers and holding crossroads, and believing that somehow, someday, all of it will mean something. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, it does.